trying to bash him publicly, trying to discredit who he was. So he basically, eventually, President George Washington would invite Isaac Backus to come and to speak on the subject several times. When it came to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, he was somebody that was there to be able to discuss, to be able to give this principle of the separation that was so needed. Interestingly enough, and we're going to conclude this in either our last lesson or the second to last lesson, Isaac Backus just concluded himself that George Washington was way more Baptist than he realized. There is evidence, and again later on, that we'll find that he likely was a Baptist. We'll get to that later on. You have to be here every class to be able to understand that, though. So you have to be here. You can't miss any classes. But he was invited by George Washington to come and to speak on religious liberty. So understand George Washington just real quickly. There's few people in history that while living and creating history understood their place in history. I hope you understood that. George Washington, I believe, understood his place in history. He understood that the experiment of America was something that the world had never seen before, and that he was the leader of these people because he was the one that the people wanted to lead. And so he was very conscious, I believe, about his historical relevance and everything that he was doing. And so with that in mind, when he asked somebody like Isaac Backus to come, you get a little bit of the mentality of George Washington as saying that men ought to be free to worship how God, with the right that God has given them to be able to do. It has nothing to do with the government. So one of the things, again, getting back to Backus, that he said in one of these times that he stood, he said, religious matters are to be separated from the jurisdiction of the state, not because they are beneath the interest of the state, but quite the contrary, but because they are too high and too holy, and thus are beyond the competence of the state. That is an awesome statement. I would take the time to go back and read the entire thing. But basically what he is saying here, the state should stay out of the church because government can't possibly understand spiritual things. That's really what he just said. Now imagine saying that in a church setting. Hey man, that's right, preacher, but he wasn't in a church setting. He was in a governmental setting, and he says, we don't have the spiritual aptitude to make spiritual decisions. We need to make government decisions in this setting. What an awesome statement that he made. He has been credited heavily for the influence of the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, in that statement there, the First Amendment, you find so many things that are contrary to what we've talked about in the last 5 or 6 weeks. Because the way that America began was completely contrary to that. And it was about them furthering what they were going to do. So we have to remember this was still in the future. All of the dream and the vision and this First Amendment, all of these things were still in the future for Isaac Backus, but he became a freedom fighter in all of that. So the continued effect of the people leaving the state churches multiplied, and the state churches started dwindling down. But just a side note, their money income didn't change. Why is that? Well, because everybody was taxed to support the church, to support the minister, and to support building the buildings. So they still had all of the money, but just their congregation or their auditoriums, if you will, weren't quite as full. So as all of this happened, groups started to become a little bit organized. One of the groups of people that saw the need to start churches in every corner of America, and that was genuinely, I believe, what their goal was, and that's what they stated. They were called the Particular Baptist. They were later known as the General Baptist, and they were predominant in the Carolinas and Virginia. Is interesting when you go down and you study what happens in Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and I'll include Georgia in that we're going to get into a little bit here in just a few minutes. You think about the impact that this has on you and I sitting here in a church in Spokane, Missouri today. It's just amazing when you stop and think about it. But it started with these Particular Baptist, again later to be known as General Baptist. So in this area, in the 1720s, again, the Great Awakening changed a lot of things. This is one of the things that happened because of this. But in this area, there were only 5 or 6 real churches in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Now think about that. Now again, I know it wasn't as populated as it is right now, but think about the landmass of those 4 states and just that area there, how much is there, and there were only 5 or 6 churches. That became a problem. Because if you're going to go to a church, you were going to have to travel quite a distance, and we're going to find that people actually were willing to travel a good bit. Now going back to Whitefield, we finished off talking about this last week. George Whitefield, though not a Baptist, holding to many Baptist doctrines, but not fully a Baptist, I believe, and I wouldn't even credit him as being that, he saw the need for churches in this area. Remember, his traveling took him down to Savannah, Georgia, where he had started the orphanage, the orphanage down in that area, which that's just an amazing thought to stop and think that early on that there were orphanages needed in the colonies, but that's a whole nother study to be done. So he traveled through this area, and as he traveled through this area, he saw the dearth of churches there, and he began to pray that God would send somebody. In 1745, while he was preaching in a town, Toland, Connecticut, there was a young man that would get saved. He would surrender to preach shortly after that and become one of the most important Baptists in the history of the United States. Perhaps he was the answer to Whitefield's prayer, and I believe that he actually was, and we'll prove that here in just a minute. So fast forward a little bit, about 10 years after this man's salvation, there were 3 paths that came through the forest there in North Carolina. The paths were named in that day, kind of like roads that we would call them today: Settlers Road, the Trading Path, and the Boone Trail. Where they converged was near Sandy Creek, North Carolina, a very strategic place because of being able to travel there with at least somewhat ease because of the paths that were going there. So this is the area of Sandy Creek. This preacher began to preach here and developed quite a reputation. His name was Shubal Stearns. I said before that there are 3 Baptists in the early American Baptists that are my 3 favorite, and they're just, I admire them and have learned so much from them and about them. I mentioned already, one of them is Obadiah Holmes, another one is Shubal Stearns. Shubal Stearns was responsible by God's power for us to be able to be where we are today. Again, I'll show you that. He was described as a very short man with a commanding presence while preaching. I look back to some of the most powerful preachers that I've been around in my life, and one of the men I was thinking about as I was kind of going over some of these notes, it was, I had his name just a second ago and I just lost it. Good night. Hold the fort. Help me, Wanda. You don't know. Okay. Wanda doesn't know, so Art Wilson, sorry. Art Wilson. Anybody ever heard Art Wilson preach? A couple few of you. Art Wilson was quite the preacher. He was not a very big man. He was a small man, but when he got up to preach, oh my. He will rip your face off and stomp on it and then hand it back to you in love. I mean, he was just that kind of a preacher. And I picture Shubal Stearns, there's a picture of him up there. You can kind of see that in him. But Shubal Stearns was the kind of preacher that developed a reputation. Though a small man, he had a commanding presence while he preached. He came there to that area in North Carolina because of what he had heard said about the area and in a letter that was written. And it stated this: the work of God was great in preaching to an ignorant people who had little or no preaching for 100 miles in no established meeting. But now the people were so eager to hear that they would come 40 miles each way when they could have opportunity to hear a sermon. Now consider the people in that day that were so needful to hear a message preached that they would travel 40 miles to do so. There are people in our church that do that. There are people in our church that do that every Sunday. But you have a car and you get to drive. That's not what they did. They would have to travel for a couple of days there, a couple of days home, just to be able to go for the sole purpose of hearing somebody preach. Shubal Stearns heard that and he says, well, they need a preacher. And so he went down there. He came there with 16 believers to start a missions work. November 22nd of 1755, Sandy Creek Baptist Church was started. Now, Shubal Stearns had no formal degree. He just knew that God had called him to preach. Now, we're going to see a pattern over, this week and as well in some of the coming weeks, that men would get saved and within weeks, God would call them to preach. Can God still do that today? Absolutely. I believe that with my whole heart that God can still do that today. But I believe that today, because of the need, because of the way America was becoming, that men would get saved and they would see that and God would put that burden upon them. And so we would find churches being started left and right because of that. So back to Shubal Stearns a little bit. He preached against all the sin of those that were living in the backcountry. Now again, that's who he was pastor to. Think about the backcountry people, those the backwards, we would call them today redneck people. They were a little bit rough, a little bit difficult probably to deal with. And there's story after story of some of them that would come to the preaching and they would be saved coming to that. But because of him, some of them together, some of these backcountry people, they took pledges that they would never become Baptist. They would never become Baptist. And so they would show up to some of the meetings for the sole purpose of mocking him, of trying to distract him, trying to distract others. One of these men is a man named Tidance Lane. He had heard of his preaching and he got curious and he went there again to discredit him, to try and mock him. But these are his words, and I'll read this kind of slowly because I want you to understand what he says here. These are Tidance Lane's word about listening to Shubal Stearns preach when he showed up really to distract him. He says this: upon my arrival, I saw a venerable old man sitting under a peach tree with a book in his hand, and the people gathered about him. He fixed his eyes upon me immediately, which made me feel in such a manner as I have never felt before. I turned to quit the place, but could not proceed far. I walked about, sometimes catching his eyes as I walked. By uneasiness increased and became intolerant. I went up to him thinking that a salutation and shaking of hands would relieve me, but it happened otherwise. I began to think that he had an evil eye and ought to be shunned. But shunning him, I could no more effect than a bird can shun a rattlesnake when it fixes its eyes upon him. When he began to preach, my perturbations or anxiety or mental uneasiness increased so that nature could no longer support them, and I sunk to the ground. Now, this is Tidance Lane who showed up to mock and to discredit this man. He couldn't go on without hearing what he was saying. His eyes caught him. And notice what he says at the end. He says, I felt like I was in a fight even against nature, and he fell to the ground. Remember last week when I was talking about Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, and in so many of those meetings there that people just lost their physical being. They would fall to the ground, and in some cases they would just be wailing, and there was such an emotion that was attached to all of this. Well, we find this man describing what he went through in his own words. Well, I think probably needless to say, he was saved very quickly. Not only was he saved, he was then discipled under the ministry of Shubal Stearns. He then later on would become the first pastor in what we know now as Tennessee. So the preaching of the Baptist now began to take a very specific characteristic. So this is kind of interesting because even still today, we look at Baptist preaching as different from other people's preaching. But in that day, even there was a difference. Some of the things that were noted in their day that were written about, the tones of voice were used to have an emotional effect. Now, again, remember what most people are used to in the standing order churches. These are just a shadow of the Church of England with all of its ritualism and a preacher getting up and just being monotone and just saying stuff, reading stuff, really not even getting excited about anything. Of course, they had nothing to get excited about. But Shubal Stearns and those of the Baptists did. There was a genuine affection in every word that they used. And they had that affection genuine or on purpose, was something that was genuine. And one of the things that we find is that the result was tears, trembling, screams and shouts, acclamations. That was the normal response. Now think about that. This was a different kind of preaching. This was a totally different kind of preaching than any of these people were used to. And God started using that. We could really say that the old-time religion was born. What we know it now as that anyway. So Shubal Stearns became the person that all of this, it really, if I could call it culture, would rally around, and we'll be spending a couple of weeks talking about how that all happened. The doctrine of Mr. Stearns and his party was consequently quite strange. This is a quote from an Anglican pastor. To be born again appeared absurd. Now, where does that term even come from? Doesn't it come from the Bible? I mean, isn't those actually words that Jesus said? That's how far America had gone away from what truth was. But I tell you, their message was something that was very simple. And as they came, it was exactly what was needed in that day. Salvation is what matters. You need to understand salvation. One author described Shubal Stearns as Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, and John Clark rolled into one. Well, that's quite a compliment. That's quite a statement. Just those are three men that we've studied up to this point, and you understand their place in history. But God used him, Shubal Stearns, and Daniel Marshall. Daniel Marshall was his brother-in-law, married Shubal Stearns' sister, and they became cohorts in a sense in their endeavors for the gospel. But God used them to start the Sandy Creek Separate Baptist Revival. He would send out preachers with one simple message. And just imagine, again, the culture and the way things were different in that day. He would tell them what their message was. Religion was real. Hell was real. Jesus was real. And you need to be born again. What a simple message. What a simple message, but that's exactly what was needed in that day. Again, that religion was real, hell was real, and Jesus was real. And there needed to be a new birth again. Well, what is the result of all of this? Between 1755 and 1757, there was an explosion of people getting saved and becoming committed to what was going on. Listen, this was different than the Great Awakening. This was an area-wide revival that rivaled the Great Awakening. But it was different than the Great Awakening. Why? Because people were saved, I believe genuinely saved during the Great Awakening, but they had nowhere to go. They had the standing order churches. That's all they had. Down in the South, now we see the real power here is because there are churches that are being established and that are starting other churches, as we'll see, that went out from there. And so many things changed in that day. So this was different than the Great Awakening because people were getting saved. People had a church where they could come. But not only that, people then were being sent out of those churches to start other churches. Some of those churches were there in Abbott Creek in North Carolina, Grassy Creek in Virginia. It's right on the North Carolina border. And then the Deep River Baptist Church in North Carolina. These were all significant churches that studying out, and again, time doesn't allow, but if you go and you study out each one of these along with Sandy Creek Baptist Church, as they started sending out pastors, something began that we still refer to today. They didn't call it this back then, but you've heard of the Bible Belt, right? The Bible Belt was started out of the ministry of Sandy Creek Baptist Church and these churches that were started out of Sandy Creek Baptist Church. Now consider this, just some food for thought. Over 125 men were sent out to start these churches overall. Again, they would be sent out from one church to another church, then that church would send out men, and that church would send out men. But 125 of them from Sandy Creek Baptist Church. That's quite a bit. We find that in 17 years that 42 churches were started. They were established. Think about that. 42 churches in just a matter of 17 years. There were many instances of men getting saved and then just right after that, surrendering to preach. As I mentioned earlier, there is one who will become significant later on. His name was Swearin' Jack Waller. The first part is obviously a nickname that was given to him for obvious reasons. Swearin' Jack Waller was a rough man, and he came much like Tidance Lane. He came to mock Shubal Stearns, but was shaken to his core when he heard him preach. He went to mock, but he ended up getting saved. He went there to mock with 7 or 8 men that he worked with. And then as he got saved, he started witnessing to those other 7 or 8 men. And they would end up getting saved. And God used him in an amazing way. But God used his conversion then to change others. This was just one of many stories that would happen. Now let's go back just very quickly. Sandy Creek Baptist Church went from 16 members to over 600 in 18 months. You talk about a growth spurt. 16 people that came with Shubal Stearns from Massachusetts, from Connecticut, came down to this area, and within 18 months, there were 600 members of this church. What an amazing thing to stop and realize what God was doing down here. It's no wonder he was able to send out men and time after time after time. And ultimately, this church would end up suffering. Not because of doctrinal failure, not because of the pastor's failure, not because of anything like this, but because they just kept sending people out. They basically depleted themselves, sending people out into the areas around them. Now, this would take a long time for them to get to that place, but ultimately that became the model for the early American churches. We see people saved, we send people out to start other churches because, remember the particular Baptist, they believed there needed to be a Baptist church in every corner of America. That's what they became passionate about. I want to share I got a few minutes left, just want to share this with you. While I was in North Carolina, I didn't look to see this until after I had gotten there. I went to my brother's house, and that night before I went to bed, I thought, I wonder how close I am to Sandy Creek Baptist Church. I was about 25 minutes from there. And so I got up the next morning and I was telling my mom and I was telling my brother about it. I was like, man, that is awesome. I may try and slip over there. If I have time, I'm going to try and slip over there. Well, the next morning, my brother had taken the day off and he said, let's go. So where are we going? He's going, whatever church you were talking about. And I'm like, Sandy Creek? He's like, yeah, let's go. And so we got in the car and we drove up there. And again, it was only 25 minutes. It wasn't a bad drive. And we got there, and I was able to walk through. They have the cemetery that is there, that has Shubal Stearns was buried there, and there are several other names that I recognized that were there that go all the way back to the 1700s. Quite fascinating. They have some monuments that are there. I've got pictures of those that kind of state the history and what's happened in that place. And I do have one picture, and sorry this isn't the greatest picture, but if you can go forward there, Jonathan, a little bit. Standing on the platform. I get emotional thinking about it right now. When I walked into that building, first of all, when you get there, there's nobody around. And I'm thinking, man, it would be awesome to go in that building. Man, it would be so cool just to walk in there. But I thought, there's nobody around. I'm not going to be able to do that. And then we walk around and we see there is a sign that says, you're welcome to enter, just don't destroy stuff. And I thought, we can go in. So we opened up the door, my brother and I did, and I walked in, and I'm not trying to be weird or anything, but I got chills. Mainly because I understand the history. I realized the things that took place in that area in that day, and that I was standing in a very historical place for not just Baptist, but for America, I believe. And so I was able to stand there. You can see that building here from a distance as we were coming up to it. And then inside it, you can find you see the column there up on the top, or the joist up on the top, how it's hand hewn. I mean, it was just awesome seeing all of those things. And so they had the chairs down, or the seats, the benches down at the bottom and the benches at the top. And I did some just rough math trying to figure out how many people could fit in this tiny little place here. A 26 by 30 building. I estimated just by the seats that were in there, you could probably fit between 80 and 90 people in those seats. Could you imagine on a hot summer day just cramming all of those people into that building, but people that wanted to be there because they knew they were going to hear a sermon that was preached? You see the stairs there, very steep stairs that kind of go up to that platform. So this 26 by 30 building was the home of Sandy Creek Baptist Church. More than 1,000 churches exist because of who was sent out from Sandy Creek Baptist Church. Do you understand the significance of this place? It's an amazing place of history, but here's what we know. A man heard a call, and he says, I must be that man. And so he took 15 other people. They went down to this place where there was no gospel influence, and God used them in a way that still today echoes throughout history, and that we can be where we are today. But persecution is going to come. As we've seen in every instance thus far, Shubal Stearns is not going to be immune to that. We find this. An Anglican minister warned as they came to that area, he says this, we have raised and propagated a most shocking delusion, which threatens the entire subversion of true religion in these parts, unless the principal persons concerned in that delusion are apprehended or otherwise restrained. That was a threat, basically saying we've got to do something about these people. They're corrupting the standing order churches. Well, that was a good thing, but persecution will come. Let's pray. Lord, we're so thankful again for the history that we can go back and realize your hand was moving in early America, and we're so thankful for that and that we can learn that. And really, hopefully, to truly value our Baptist heritage and what we have here today. Continue to help us and meet with us today. We ask for your sake. Amen.